I never expected my life to turn out this way. I was 27, a mom of one, and managing the chaos of parenthood just fine. My husband, Ethan, and I had our hands full with our 2-year-old son, Noah, when an unexpected request knocked on our door, or rather, was dropped on our doorstep. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. Ethan had just come home from work, and I was juggling making dinner while keeping Noah entertained with his blocks. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find my mother-in-law, Janet, standing there. Her face was drawn, her eyes carrying a weight of unspoken words. In her arms was a tiny baby girl, bundled in a pink blanket. Janet didn't wait for pleasantries. She handed the baby to me, her voice hurried and clipped. "It's just for a couple of weeks, Laura," she said, looking past me into the house, avoiding my eyes. "Riley needs to get back to college, and there's no one else to take care of her baby." Riley, Ethan's younger sister, was 20 at the time. We weren't particularly close with her, and her pregnancy had been one of those things whispered about at family gatherings. Her boyfriend had bolted the moment he heard the word baby. I hadn't seen Riley since the birth, and I didn't know much beyond the fact that she was trying to piece her life together. I looked down at the baby in my arms. She couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her tiny mouth forming a perfect O as she slept, a fragile, warm bundle of innocence. "Just a couple of weeks?" I asked, the uncertainty clear in my voice. Ethan, now standing beside me, put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Yes," Janet insisted. "We're helping Riley get an apartment near campus. She'll be back for the baby soon. Please, just help us out." Her eyes held a desperation I couldn't ignore. Ethan and I exchanged a glance. We loved kids. We weren't planning on having a second child so soon, but how could we say no to family? To a baby who needed care, even if just temporarily? "Okay," I agreed reluctantly. "Just for a couple of weeks." I had no idea how much those words would change everything. The first few days were a whirlwind. We named the baby Lily because no one told us if Riley had given her a name. It felt strange, calling her just the baby. Noah was fascinated by his new sister and kept peeking into the bassinet, his chubby hands reaching out to touch her tiny fingers. I was exhausted, but in a good way. The kind of exhaustion that comes with rocking a baby to sleep at 2 a.m. and feeling her tiny heart beating next to yours. I started to feel a connection, a protective pull I hadn't anticipated, but as the days turned into weeks, a gnawing sense of unease grew in my chest. Janet had gone radio silent. We hadn't heard a word from Riley either. Our texts went unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. By the time 6 weeks had passed, the unease had turned into dread. One night, Ethan sat beside me on the couch, his jaw tight. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "They promised 2 weeks. It's been nearly 2 months. We can't keep going like this." I nodded, feeling the same weight of uncertainty. But what could we do? We were stuck in limbo, caring for a child who wasn't ours, yet somehow was becoming ours with every passing day. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, Janet re-emerged. She showed up one cold morning, her face pale and eyes avoiding mine. I stood in the doorway holding Lily, my heart pounding. "We need to talk," she said, her voice empty of emotion. I knew whatever she was about to say would change everything. I invited Janet inside, though every fiber of my being screamed not to. My arms tightened instinctively around Lily as I led her to the living room. The room felt colder than usual, the walls closing in on the weight of whatever she was about to drop on us. Janet didn't sit. She stood near the window, her hands wringing together as if she could squeeze the truth into something easier to swallow. "She's not coming back," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I blinked, trying to process what she meant. "What do you mean she's not coming back?" I asked, my voice tight. Janet let out a shaky breath. "Riley's gone. She left the country. She said she wanted to live a free-spirited life. No responsibilities, no strings. She doesn't want to be a mother anymore." I felt like the room was spinning. I looked down at Lily, who was wide awake now, her big eyes staring up at me, completely unaware of the storm her world was caught in. "She's just abandoning her?" My voice cracked. The words felt vile coming out of my mouth, like they didn't belong in reality. Janet nodded, guilt etched into every line on her face. She made up her mind. "We spent the past 2 months getting everything sorted. Her passport, her travel plans. She didn't even want to say goodbye. I sank onto the couch, my legs barely holding me up. I felt Ethan's hand on my back, his warmth grounding me, but even that wasn't enough to steady the waves of anger and disbelief crashing over me. She can't just do that, I muttered. She can't just walk away from her own baby? She already did, Janet said, her voice hollow. She expects you to raise Lily now. She said it was best for everyone. Best for everyone. How could abandoning a child ever be the best for anyone? I looked at Janet, my anger boiling over. You knew about this and didn't tell us? You let us believe this was temporary while she made plans to disappear? Janet's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought maybe she'd change her mind, but she didn't. Ethan's voice was cold, cutting through the tension. This isn't right. You should have told us the truth from the beginning. You let us get attached, and now you're just dumping this on us. Janet flinched, but she didn't argue. I'm sorry, I truly am, but I can't take her. I'm too old. I don't have the energy or the means to raise another child. She looked at Lily with a mixture of regret and sadness, then back at me. I know it's unfair to ask, but will you take her in? The weight of the question pressed down on my chest. I looked at Lily, her tiny fingers curled around my thumb. How could I say no? How could I look into her innocent eyes and tell her she wasn't wanted, that she was left behind like an unwanted object? Ethan's voice broke through my thoughts. We need to think about this, Janet. This isn't a decision we can make lightly. Janet nodded and quietly left, the door closing behind her with a finality that made my heart ache. Ethan and I sat in silence for a long time after she left, the only sound the gentle coos of Lily in my arms. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice soft. What are we going to do, Laura? I looked at him, tears pooling in my eyes. I don't know if we can do this, I whispered, but I don't know how we don't do this. He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. She deserves a family. She didn't ask for any of this. I nodded. Neither did we. We sat there, the enormity of the decision hanging between us. But as I looked down at Lily, something shifted in my heart, a quiet certainty. She needs us, I said, my voice firm. We can't let her be tossed aside. She's ours now, Ethan. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the same mixture of fear and resolve. Okay, he said softly. We'll do it. We'll raise her as our own. The words felt right. Scary, but right. That night, I held Lily close as she slept, her tiny breaths a steady rhythm against my chest. I whispered promises to her, promises I would keep for as long as I lived. You're safe now. You're loved. You're ours. From that night on, everything changed. It was like a line had been drawn between what life used to be and what it was now. Lily wasn't just the baby we were looking after anymore. She was our baby, our daughter. Ethan and I didn't say it out loud, but we felt it in every quiet moment, in every glance exchanged as we watched her sleep. The days blurred into weeks and weeks into months. Our routine shifted, adapting to the needs of a newborn. Nappies, midnight feedings, soft lullabies whispered into the dark. Noah adjusted quickly, as if Lily had always been a part of his little world. He called her Lily Bean and loved showing her his toys, even if she was too small to understand. But it wasn't all sweet moments. There were hard days, too. Days when the exhaustion gnawed at me and I wondered if we'd made a mistake. Nights when Lily's cries felt like they'd never stop and my patience frayed to a thin thread. But every time I felt like breaking, I'd look into her eyes, those deep, innocent eyes, and remember the promise I made to her. You're safe now. You're loved. We didn't hear from Janet or Riley. The silence was deafening at first, like a door slammed shut that we couldn't reopen. Ethan's decision to cut off contact with his mom was painful, but we agreed we couldn't let the people who had betrayed our trust have power over us anymore. We had to build our life on our own terms and protect our family in our own way, and so we did. We went through the legal process of adoption. It was a long, winding road filled with paperwork, court visits, and anxious waiting. Our lawyer, Mr. Ramirez, was kind and patient, explaining everything in simple terms. He reassured us that abandonment was a clear path to terminating Riley's parental rights. One rainy Tuesday morning, we sat in a small courtroom, holding hands so tightly my fingers turned numb. I remember looking at Lily, dressed in a little yellow dress, oblivious to the gravity of what was happening. When the judge finally declared us her legal parents, Tears welled up in my eyes. She was ours, not just in love, but in law. We left the courthouse with a new sense of hope, the rain letting up just enough for the sun to peek through the clouds. It felt symbolic, like a sign that brighter days were ahead. Life settled into a new rhythm. Noah turned 3, and Lily grew from a fragile baby into a curious toddler. Her laughter filled the house, a sound so pure it felt like a balm on all the wounds left behind by Riley's choices. Ethan and I learned to balance work, parenting, and each other. Some days we stumbled, but we always found our way back. 2 years later, we welcomed another daughter, Emma. Our little family felt complete. 3 children, each with their own quirks, filling our days with joy and chaos. For a while, everything was peaceful. Riley was a ghost from the past, a name we didn't mention. We focused on the present, on building memories and cherishing the life we'd created. Then, out of nowhere, the past came knocking again. It was a warm Saturday afternoon. Ethan had taken Noah and Emma to the park, and I was at home with Lily, now 5 years old. We were baking cookies, flour dusting her cheeks as she giggled and helped stir the batter. The doorbell rang, and I froze, a chill sweeping through me. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and peeked through the peephole. My heart dropped to my stomach. Riley stood there, her hair perfectly styled, a man beside her, her fiancé, I assumed. She looked different, older, but still carrying that air of entitlement I remembered so well. I opened the door just enough to speak. "What are you doing here?" My voice was calm, but my heart was pounding. Riley's eyes flickered toward Lily, who was peeking around my leg. Her face softened, a calculated expression of regret. "Laura," she said, her voice dripping with forced sincerity, "I'm getting married, and I want my daughter back." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. My jaw clenched. "Your daughter? You abandoned her, Riley. You walked away. She's my daughter now." Her fiancé spoke up, his tone polite but firm. "Look, we're just trying to do the right thing here. Riley made a mistake, but she wants to fix it." I stepped back, my hand tightening around the door. You don't fix abandonment with a simple, "I want her back." It doesn't work that way. Riley's eyes narrowed. The fake kindness slipped away, replaced by frustration. "You've had your turn playing mom. I want her back now. It's time she knows who her real mother is." Something inside me snapped. I turned, walked to the hallway, and grabbed the stack of adoption papers we kept in a folder just in case. I returned to the door, my hands shaking slightly. "See these?" I held up the papers, my voice steady. "This says I'm her mother. Legally. Permanently. You don't get to waltz back into her life like she's some forgotten accessory." I pushed the door closed, her shocked face the last thing I saw before it clicked shut. She started shouting from the other side, banging on the wood, but I didn't care. I leaned my forehead against the door, my heart racing. Lily's small voice broke the silence. "Mommy, who was that?" I turned around, my face softening as I looked at her. I knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Just someone from the past, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and ran back to the kitchen, eager to finish our cookies. I took a deep breath and followed her, feeling the weight of the encounter settle in my chest. I had done what needed to be done. No one, not Riley, not anyone, was going to take my daughter away from me. The shouting outside faded, replaced by the low hum of my own thoughts. I stood still for a moment, my hand pressed against the door, grounding myself. My heart was pounding so hard, I felt it in my throat, but I couldn't let that fear take over. Not now. Not when Lily needed me to stay strong. I took a deep breath and walked back into the kitchen, where Lily was perched on her step stool, carefully spooning dough onto the baking sheet. She glanced up and grinned, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Her world was still safe, still warm, still ours, and I would keep it that way. "Ready to pop these in the oven, Lily Bean?" I asked, keeping my voice light. She nodded enthusiastically. "Yep, then we can eat 'em with milk." I smiled, ruffling her hair. "You got it, kiddo." For the next hour, I pushed Riley's intrusion out of my mind. The smell of warm cookies filled the air, and Lily's giggles were like little sunbeams cutting through the storm clouds inside me. I wanted to freeze this moment forever. Just us, safe and happy. But reality doesn't pause. It waits in the shadows, ready to pounce. That night, after the kids were asleep and the house was quiet, I told Ethan everything. He listened, his jaw tightening, his knuckles white as he clenched the arm of the couch. She really thinks she can just come back and demand Lily like she's reclaiming lost luggage? His voice was low, the anger barely held back. She does, I said, my voice tired. And she's not backing down. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his eyes dark with worry. We knew something like this could happen. We knew she might come back one day. Yeah, I whispered, but I didn't expect it to feel like a war. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. We'll fight it, Laura. Whatever it takes. The next few days were a blur of whispers and cold shoulders. Riley didn't stop at banging on our door. She took her story online, Facebook, Instagram, anywhere people would listen. She painted herself as a broken woman who just wanted her child back, twisting every fact until we were the villains, the heartless couple who stole her baby and refused to give her back. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members. Some were confused, some were angry. A few tried to stay neutral, but neutrality felt like a betrayal too. My mother-in-law, Janet, joined in. She called us selfish, claiming we were punishing Riley for her youthful mistakes. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman who had dropped Lily into my arms like an unwanted burden now demanded we give her back. I tried to stay calm, but doubt crept in, whispering in the back of my mind, what if they're right? What if I'm just holding on too tight because I'm afraid to lose her? But then I'd look at Lily, laughing with Noah, holding Emma's hand as they played, and I knew the truth. She was where she belonged. She was home. One evening, a week after Riley's return, Ethan and I sat at the dining table, our lawyer, Mr. Ramirez, on the phone. His voice crackled through the speaker, steady and reassuring. She has no legal standing, he said. The adoption was finalized years ago. Her rights were terminated. She can't change that just because she wants to. What about the court of public opinion? I asked. She's got half the family convinced we're monsters. Mr. Ramirez sighed. You can't control what people believe, Laura. All you can do is protect Lily and your family. If she tries to harass you, we can get a restraining order. But legally, you're on solid ground. I nodded, though my stomach was still in knots. Thank you, Mr. Ramirez. Ethan ended the call, and we sat in silence for a while. The weight of it all pressed down on us. The fight wasn't over, but at least we knew where we stood. Finally, Ethan spoke. We're doing the right thing, no matter what anyone says. I squeezed his hand. I know, but even knowing didn't make it easier. The next day, Riley showed up again. This time, she didn't come alone. Janet was with her, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. I saw them through the window as they walked up the driveway, their eyes fixed on the front door like it was a battlefield. I braced myself, took a deep breath, and opened the door before they could knock. What do you want, Riley? My voice was cold, guarded. Riley's eyes were red-rimmed, her face tight with frustration. I want to see Lily. No, I said firmly. You don't get to see her. You gave up that right when you left? Janet stepped forward, her voice shaking. Laura, please. She's her mother. She just wants a chance to make things right. I felt my anger rise. Where was this need to make things right 5 years ago? Where was she when Lily took her first steps? When she called me mommy for the first time? Riley's voice cracked. I made a mistake. I know that now. I'm trying to fix it. I shook my head, my voice low and steady. Some mistakes can't be fixed. Lily isn't a mistake to be undone. She's a little girl who deserves stability, love, and parents who won't abandon her. Riley's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't waver. Janet's gaze dropped to the ground, as if she knew there was no argument left to make. Please leave, I said. Don't come back. Riley's shoulders slumped. She looked defeated, but something in her eyes told me this wasn't over. Janet took her arm and guided her away, her face pale and drawn. As they walked back down the driveway, I closed the door and locked it. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I knew I'd done the right thing. Lily's voice floated in from the living room. Mommy, can we play a game? I wiped my eyes and smiled, pushing everything else aside. Of course, Lily Bean. I walked into the living room where my children were waiting. This was my world, my family, and no matter how hard Riley tried, she wasn't going to take it away from me. The days after Riley and Janet's visit passed quietly, like the calm after a storm, but I knew better than to think it was over. That kind of silence isn't peace. It's the stillness of someone plotting their next move. I tried to let it go, to focus on my family and the life we had built, but a shadow of worry lingered in the back of my mind. Then one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees and bathed our home in golden light, the phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. My stomach clenched, but I answered anyway. "Hello?" A man's voice came through, hesitant but clear. "Hi, is this Laura?" "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Jacob," he said. "Riley's ex-fiancé." I stiffened. "Why are you calling me?" He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with regret. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I felt like you should know. Riley and I broke up. I didn't know the full story until recently, and I can't be part of what she's doing. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for any trouble I caused by supporting her. I see now that you were just protecting your family." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "Thank you for telling me. I appreciate it," he sighed. "I don't know what she'll do next, but I wanted to apologize. I hope you and your family can move on from this." "Thank you," I said softly. "I hope you find peace too." He hung up, and I stood there for a moment, phone in hand, the weight of his words settling over me. Riley was unraveling, and now even those closest to her were walking away. I went to the window and looked out at the yard, where Ethan was playing with the kids. Noah was chasing Bubbles, Emma toddling after him, and Lily stood in the middle of it all, her face tilted up, laughing as Bubbles floated around her. The sound of her laughter filled me with a warmth so deep, it melted away the last of my fear. This was our life. This was real. A few days later, the online drama reached a boiling point. Riley had posted another video, this time accusing her own mother, Janet, of pushing her to give Lily up. The comments were a mess of blame, sympathy, and outrage. It felt like watching a wildfire consume everything in its path, but I stayed out of it. We blocked, ignored, and moved on. The thing about people like Riley is that they thrive on attention. Without it, they wither. Eventually, her posts stopped. The messages from family faded away. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't ominous. It was relief. One morning, I sat on the porch, a cup of coffee warming my hands, watching the sun rise. Ethan joined me, his arm brushing mine, the quiet of dawn wrapping around us like a blanket. "I think it's over," he said softly. "Maybe," I replied. "But even if it isn't, we'll be okay." He nodded. "Yeah, we will." Because we were a team. We had faced storms, betrayal, and doubt, and we were still standing, stronger even. The love we had for our children, all of them, was a bond no one could break. Lily's 6th birthday came soon after. We threw a small party in the backyard with balloons, cupcakes, and a homemade piñata. Noah ran around with his friends, and Emma clapped her little hands at every burst of laughter. Lily wore a bright blue dress and a crown made of paper and glitter. She was radiant, her joy infectious. As she blew out her candles, her eyes met mine, and she beamed. "I wish for more happy days, Mommy." Tears pricked my eyes, but I smiled. "That's the best wish ever, sweetheart." That night, after the kids were asleep and the house was quiet, I looked at Ethan. "We did it. We made it through." He wrapped his arms around me, his voice a whisper in my ear. "We always will. Because love isn't just about the easy days. It's about standing firm when the winds howl, about choosing to stay when running would be easier. It's about promises kept, even when they're hard. And in the end, that's what makes a family. We were a family. Messy, imperfect, but whole. And no one could take that away. Story 2. Always preferred my sister and kicked me over a misplaced bracelet. So years later, when Grandma left the family inheritance instead of her, they showed up at my door sobbing. Most people would define a middle-class home like the one I grew up in. 2 parents, a younger sister, and a modest suburban house. To outsiders, we seemed a picture-perfect family. Everyone close to us would tell you, though, that my parents and I were always tense. There was just a basic cause. I was always the last consideration. They loved my younger sister, Emma. Not always, though, was the case. My parents were quite kind and caring to Emma and me when we were young. They lavished loving attention onto us. And why would they not also? We were a quite smart couple, shining in whatever we could do. We discussed the golden age when nothing seemed to split us. Our parents were equally pleased with us. We were registered in gymnastics, art classes, and piano lessons. Back then, I never felt any strain, not even a faint inclination for one of us over the other. Things changed, though, when I entered 6th grade. It began with a single test. Though I received a poor mark, it was not especially crucial either. My first failing mark in life. Still, it was enough to start my parents perceiving me differently. When my mother avoided looking at me the same way she did Emma, I knew something had changed. Her bringing home another flawless score made the compliments they had once offered me seem required. Emma's achievements were welcomed with real joy, but now I was the loose thread that might fall free at any moment. Emma was the one without sinfulness as well. I first considered it to be only a phase. Perhaps I was overly sensitive, but it became impossible to overlook. Should I make a mistake? It would not matter how minor it was held against me. Should Emma err? It was either brushed aside or worse, excused. She just has an off day. While for me it was always, my father would say, "Why are you not more like Emma?" That sentence tormented me over my teenage years. Emma bloomed into everything my parents had ever dreamed of in a daughter as we grew older. She was gregarious, smart, and popular. She was the homesteering queen, the class president, the girl everyone loved. Conversely, I started to withdraw more. I stayed to myself, studied diligently, and performed brilliantly in my own right measure. Still, it never would have been sufficient to match Emma. And shortly enough, I quit trying. The variations in our treatment had become really clear by the time we were in high school. Emma always acquired fresh clothing, her own car, and all the attention. Our parents would spend hours sitting with her to make sure she grasped every detail when she needed help with homework. When I requested help, it was either too late in the evening, or they would dismiss me and advise me to work it out on my own. While coddling Emma like a princess, they had begun treating me like a grown-up. Early on, I realized I would have to work for anything I wanted. Emma got everything on a silver platter, despite the disparity in treatment, and I tried to keep a relationship with her. She was my sister, so I loved her, but it becomes more difficult to overlook her developing entitlement. Knowing she could get away with anything, she seemed to savor the attention. Not only were her loved ones, my parents included, her beauty enthralled our friends, instructors, even total strangers. I was the shadow in the background. She was the shining gal. I started to question whether I was simply Emma's sister, or if nobody actually saw me for who I was. The tipping point arrived one summer following my high school graduation. Having been accepted on a partial scholarship to a reputable college, I was eager to at last leave the house and start over. I reasoned that perhaps with some space, my connection with my parents would heal, and that they would at last miss me when I was away. I was mistaken. Emma began dating Jake, the standout quarterback for our high school football team at this time. He came from a wealthy background, was popular, and looked well. Of course, my folks loved him. They treated him the way only the kid they never had did. Jake came over at our house every weekend, and my parents would prepare fancy dinners just to wow him. They were obviously seeing a time when Emma and Jake would be married, settled down, and produce the ideal grandchildren. I was working part-time to help pay for my first semester of college and finding it difficult. Not so much with my scholarship exhausted. I would come home on breaks, and all I would hear about was Emma and Jake's most recent trip or Emma's class performance. Nobody inquired about my management style or me personally. And to cap it all off, they would also be caustic, asking why I couldn't find someone like Jake. Then arrived the charge meant to destroy the last dynamics of our family. One weekend on a break from college, I paid a visit home, until Emma's beautiful gold charm bracelet, which Jake had given her, vanished. Everything seemed normal. Emma was upset, and it was a costly item. When they couldn't find it, my parents entered complete panic mode and started tearing the home apart. Emma asked whether I had perhaps taken it. She wasn't joking, but first I believed she was. She stated she had seen me loving the bracelet the night before and hinted that I might have removed it out of envy. I was enraged. I hadn't touched her jewelry, not even had I considered it twice. Still, my folks moved without delay. They naturally believed her without inquiry. I object, I swore. Naturally, I hadn't taken anything, but my folks wouldn't pay attention. They persuaded me I had taken it out of anger. Even now, my father remarked something along the lines of, "We were always aware of your jealousy of Emma." That damaged more than anything they had ever said. Like all those years of striving to get their approval, of trying to be a nice daughter, had meant nothing. They imposed an ultimatum upon me: get back the jewelry or leave the house. What I was hearing defied belief. I offered no evidence of my innocence, just my word. That was insufficient, though, for them. They had formed their opinions beforehand. I departed thus. I packed, left the door, and turned back, not looking. I terminated all relations with them. There was no choice available. I couldn't live in a house where I was treated like a criminal for nothing I had done. Until I could get back on my feet, I stayed with a buddy, and it was the last annual conversation I had with my folks. Over the next years, I battled without the help of my family. I had to work things out alone. I barely survived juggling a job and education. There were days when I felt I wouldn't make it, but I did. I graduated, had a good job, and began gently establishing a life for myself. I learned, meanwhile, from common acquaintances that Emma was doing great. She had landed a lucrative job in some marketing company, and Jake was still with her. Her entry was assisted by my father. For them, nothing had appeared to have changed. Still the ideal family, devoid of me. 5 years went by before I got another contact from my relatives. From ground zero, I had to build my life. My grandmother was the only one who could provide me with moral support and any kind of assistance. More precisely, the mother of my dad. Still, out of the blue, I got an invitation to my grandmother's Christmas dinner. Said the least, I was astonished. Even after all that had transpired, my grandma had always been the one member of the family treating me fairly. She never brought up my parents or tried to persuade me to make up with them. She would send me the odd birthday card or SMS to check in. I was so unsure whether I wanted to go when I received the invite, but I should, according to something within me. Arriving at the dinner seemed like entering a time capsule. Along with a few other relatives, my parents, Emma, and even Jake were there. One could clearly feel the strain. Emma behaved as though nothing had ever happened between us, and my parents met me stiffly. They seemed to be expecting me to follow her ideal family act and ignore the past. Though the evening was awkward, I managed. Then, towards the conclusion of the evening, my grandmother began distributing gifts. Though I had not expected anything especially noteworthy, opening the gift almost stopped my heart. Inside the package was a vintage family heirloom and gold locket handed down for decades. Not any piece of jewelry either. Considered the legitimate heir to the family's fortune was whoever inherited this locket. Grandma had gotten it from her father, and now she was handing it straight to me. Ignoring her son, my father, and every other grandchild, including Emma, it was a monument to more than just custom. It meant that someday everything my grandparents owned, their house, their land, their savings, would be mine. When my parents realized what had just transpired, I could see their faces become pale. Emma, the golden child, sat there in startled quiet. She had always. Though my parents changed rapidly to try to conceal their disbelief with foregrins, I could feel the tension in the room. The supper was unpleasant, and shortly after my parents drew me away, they suddenly became contrite, as though a few nice words could erase all those years of neglect and mistreatment. Emma might be getting married soon, they mentioned, and they wanted me to be back in the family for her benefit. But I was wiser. Family or affection were not at issue here. This pertained to money. Our family has always valued heirloom items highly, and now that I had them, they realized I would be the one inheriting all that went along with them. Their priorities were me, not about mending the relationship. What they stood to lose frightened them. They were ready to forgive me for everything and start anew. My father even remarked in a tone more suited for a warning than an offer. They seemed to have forgotten who had initially offended who else. Other family also chipped in, pushing me to be reasonable. No matter what had happened in the past, they said that family is everything, and that I should be in close proximity to them. The cliches lined up nearly audible to me. Sharing is caring. Though it's quite evident what I should and shouldn't do, blood is thicker than water, and you don't want to be alone now. This whole issue has me overanalyzing all this strain. Knowing they just appreciated me because of what I now held, would I want to be a member of this family once more? Knowing that their abrupt interest in me sprang from self-interest, could I forgive them? Regarding this, do you folks have any ideas? If so, I would most definitely benefit from some updated one. I returned to my flat, overwhelmed following the Christmas party. Processing all that had happened seemed difficult. For the most part of the evening, I attempted to avoid my parents and relatives as much as I could, but their persistent attempts to approach me were relentless. Emma would not quit beaming at me as if we were suddenly best friends, while my parents kept sending regretful looks my way. But I realized their motivations were more towards the family riches now linked to the heritage I had been handed than they were about family itself. Their actions simply made me want to separate myself even more. The next few days were for introspection. I knew I had to have a suitable chat with my grandmother. Practically as much as symbolically, the brooch was significant. It meant I would be inheriting family assets. Though I wasn't specifically searching for it, I wanted clarity now that it was on my plate. Without knowing what it all truly meant, I wasn't ready to be caught in family riches and heritage. I was still uncomfortable bringing up the topic when I visited my grandmother. I asked her straight what it all meant after thanking her for putting faith in me with the heirloom. I wanted to be straightforward. I was not interested in family assets. Should it be dragging me back into the anarchy? I had made great effort to flee. If it came my way, I would use it sensibly, but it wasn't a top concern. Grandma listened intently and then spoke to me about something I hadn't quite grasped previously. For years, she had been observing everything happen. She had seen how far the family had turned from her, particularly following my parents and my falling out. She said she knew the family dynamics were off and that I had been treated unfairly, especially by Emma and my dad. She even knew about how I had battled to help myself while in college, working several jobs just to survive while Emma was always given a free ride. Grandma said she hadn't meddled all these years since she thought people should live their own lives. She realized, though, that her assets needed to be passed on to someone responsible, someone who would not simply take them for granted or squander them. When she saw how things had turned out and how I had been mistreated, but yet managed to establish something for myself, she chose me for this reason. Her will already included my name? She had made. Her candor really startled me. It evolved beyond the heirloom now. It revolved around confidence. Grandma thought I would be quite careful with everything, and that accountability seemed both weighty and significant. She told me this was about putting the family's future in hands she knew would do right by it, not about honoring me for what I had gone through. And as much as it seemed odd to be the one in this role, I felt validated in no small measure. All those years of being the neglected daughter suddenly didn't matter. More importantly than anything, Grandma had seen the truth. Still, this simplified a lot but also made things more difficult. I knew my parents and Emma were going to attempt all they could to wiggle their way back in, and the inheritance still loomed large. They were not going to let it go lightly since they understood what was at risk. Create 2 updates. Hello, Reddit users. Returning with an update, things have gone from bad to worse. You know my family's situation is messy if you have been following along, but I felt returning to school would provide some serenity. I mistook things. So much has transpired. Honestly, I need to let go before I lose my sanity. Following the Christmas catastrophe, for which my parents and Emma essentially pleaded for the family inheritance, I went back to my flat, intending to spend a few days away from the anarchy. Just trying to cut off the continuous calls and texts from my family, I succeeded in drowning myself in work. Naturally, though, the calm was fleeting. The messages never stopped. Not just for Emma's parents, but also for my wider relatives. Relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly felt it was their responsibility to referee the matter. Each was repeating the same sentences. Family is the most important thing. Allow money to pull you apart really quickly, and my preferred one as well. You are acting selfishly. The fact that these relatives knew only the partial truth made things worse. They were nowhere when my parents turned against me. Alternatively, what? While Emma was having her ideal life with everything provided to her, I had to scrounge together money for food and rent during college. Their concerns were not the years of neglect. Their main concern was what they had heard from my parents, who were now deftly acting as the victims. Their opinions seemed to be smothering me. I reasoned I could just ignore it all and concentrate on my work. Then, though, things turned shockingly different. Completely out of the blue, one afternoon my parents and Emma arrived at my flat. You did indeed read right. They arrived uninvited at my house, like they were on a mission, and their goal was to compel me into some sort of, on their terms, reconciliation. They were obviously calling my name, hammering on the door, and I could hear my mother sobbing from the corridor. I turned still. Looking horrified, my friend, who had been residing with me for a few months, had no idea what to do. My parents started begging right there in front of my pal as soon as I opened the door, saying how we should repair this and how they couldn't lose me. My mother was crying, as though I were the one who had done something wrong. My dad continued stating they were ready to forgive me for everything. Emma stood there seeming falsely worried while I could see right through her. She was more concerned about what would happen should I refuse to share the fortune than in reconciliation. Whispering to them that this wasn't the place or time to have this conversation, I attempted to keep things quiet, but they weren't listening. While my dad stayed in the doorway, refusing to leave, my mother essentially pushed past me and trying to enter the flat. Emma would get married shortly, and they kept chatting over me about how the family needed to be entire once more before that happened. They made it appear as though I was the one separating the family while trying to get me to consent to part of the future inheritance. Mind you, I do not formally yet have. The sight was embarrassing all around. Starting to observe the anarchy developing from their rooms, my neighbors started leaving. Though I was trying my best to keep it under control, they got louder the longer they stayed. Emma stood there looking arrogant, knowing she was putting me down while my mother was on her knees pleading with me to pardon them. Eventually, trapped, I knew nothing about what to do. They weren't moving when I tried urging them to go. At last, after what seemed like hours of begging, I could bear it no more. I phoned the security, who fortunately showed up quite fast. Originally courteous, asking my parents to depart, my parents objected. Security had to become strict at this point, warning them to summon the cops should they fail to leave. It was embarrassing in whole new terms. At last, my parents backed down, but not before my mom angrily said I was deserting my family in front of everyone. As if that were not sufficient, Emma went one step farther. She left and then mass texted a number of my pals, informing them I had turned away my parents and her. She left out the part where they had disowned me for something I never even did, so presenting me as the villain in all of this. I had to go over the whole matter since some of my pals were naturally perplexed. It was draining, and Emma's willingness to go just to fit her victim image astounded me. I'm not sure now what to do. Since that moment, I haven't communicated with my parents. I'm trying to move on, but their desperation keeps me under continual scrutiny. I feel as though I am being driven into a corner, anticipated to show up merely to satisfy everyone else. I cannot overlook, though, how they handled me. Simultaneous with this is an intense pressure. Part of me questions if it will ever cease or if I will have to cope with this the rest of my life. Right now, I simply want to pay attention to my future and myself, but my family seems driven to bring me back into their chaos. Update 3. Hi, Reddit once more. People get ready since my last update, things have spiraled much more. Following the flat incident whereby Emma and my folks showed up without warning, things got much more disorganized, and I had to perform a lot of damage control, especially with friends. Emma's tiny gesture of texting my buddies, first of all, put everyone in a somewhat embarrassing posture. It was quite taxing to have to go over the whole family turmoil from beginning to end. What made it even more odd was how my friends got their numbers in the first place. Since none of them had handed it to her, I felt exactly as perplexed as they did. Said another way, it was eerie, though they were also naturally terrified. My buddies were helpful. Emma's message presented me as this merciless person who had turned my back on my family. Hence, at first they had no idea what to believe, though it was uncomfortable having to wear out all this dirty laundry simply to clear my name. Thankfully, they understood once I explained the reality and showed them the pattern of deception. Then my grandma intervened just when I felt I could at last relax. She seemed unhappy about the escalation of the flat issue since apparently word of it had found her. Grandma chose to handle the relatives who had been spewing comments about me without me even asking. Instead of facing my parents straightforwardly, she visited many of my cousins, uncles, and aunts to clear the record. She managed it in her normal, quiet, but successful manner. She has always been the calm but no-nonsense sort. As it happens, my relatives had been fed a somewhat different interpretation of events. Apparently, my parents had informed them they rejected me when they discovered the gold bracelet Emma claimed I had taken from my drawer. They claimed to have cut off contact with me and realized I was unreliable. When Grandma shared this with me, I found it hard to believe. That had never transpired. My drawer turned up no bracelets. Actually, I had never even laid eyes on the disputed jewelry. All of it was a lie. Grandma shared my level of surprise. She had figured that my parents treated me the way they did for a reason, but learning this untruth transformed her life. When she faced the rest of the family about how they had been spewing unfounded charges about me without even knowing the truth, she was unreserved. She clarified the actual reason I was disowned. Emma had lied, and my parents had supported her without even allowing me time to defend myself. My cousins found great surprise. They had no idea they had been a part of such a convoluted story. Once the truth was out, I began to hear previously unheard of comments from other family members. My parents apparently had been hiding much more than their partiality towards Emma. One of my aunts noted that my dad had severely strained their finances by taking out a second mortgage on the house to cover some of Emma's lavish wedding plans. Another cousin let it slip that Emma had been a complete misery during wedding planning, acting out of frustration because things weren't flawless enough. But about Emma and Jake, the biggest bombshell was, although lately I had not heard anything about their relationship, allegedly, things were not working out. Jake had deserted Emma. First startled, the more I studied, the more logical it made sense. My relatives claimed that Jake had grown bored with Emma's irrational demands and continuous outbursts. He was worn out with her treating him like one of her doormats. But another layer existed there as well. Jake had also come to see that family wealth's promises weren't going to show up as readily as he had assumed. Although my parents had hinted at providing financial support, it became abundantly evident that things were far more complicated given the turmoil around the heirloom and inheritance. Deciding to flee before descending farther, he noticed the inscription on the wall. The family caught this news like wildfire, and I couldn't help but experience a range of feelings. I felt bad for Emma, part of me. Though all she had done, another side of me felt validated. I have been made to feel like the outcast, the issue, and now Emma's flawless existence was showing flaws. There was nothing they could do to stop it. It was as though whatever they had tried to hide was disintegrating before their eyes. My relatives, the same ones who had been so eager to criticize me based on my parents, started reaching out somewhere among all this anarchy. When they thought I had taken the bracelet, they were sorry for the nasty remarks and criticism they had directed against me. Seeing their abrupt shift of heart felt unusual. They told me they only wanted what was best for the family, and they repeated pleading for pardon since the truth was out. To be honest, though, after everything, I felt no desire for anything involving them. Based just on a story, I couldn't help but wonder if it would be as simple for them to turn on me. What then? Stopping them from repeating their behavior. If my parents had been able to rapidly change their views in the past, supporting Emma and disowning me, what assurance did I have that they wouldn't do the same if another scenario arose? I felt as though I would be perpetually treading on eggshells around them, wondering whether their allegiance to me was sincere or only pragmatic. Right now, I would much prefer to pause from all of them and concentrate on myself. Let them negotiate their own mess without pulling me back into it. Having all of this, my parents also contacted once more. Their tone this time, though, changed. They were not guilt-tripping me anymore or demanding. Though I could see through it, they were nearly contrite. Their preoccupation still lay with money, still trying to straighten things out just enough to get the future inheritance. They didn't give a damn about really healing our relationship. Particularly with Emma's future seeming less certain than it had been, they worried about maintaining appearances and ensuring financial stability. I haven't answered them, and to be honest, I'm not sure I will. Even if my family comes bringing apologies, this whole experience has been a sobering reminder of how poisonous they can be. I'm not ready to open that door once more. Right now, I'm mostly thinking ahead and about myself. I want to expand on my own terms, free from the weight of their falsehoods and manipulation hovering over me. That is plenty for now. Reddit. I appreciate all of your guidance and encouragement all through. Though it's been a bumpy road, I believe I'm at last seeing things more clearly. Story 3. Parents said I was trying to grab my sister's husband. Years later, my sister discovered her husband had framed me using my identity and APS number, having discovered he was cheating. Though I never imagined I would be writing this, here I am, still reeling from the events of the past several months. It all began when my life veered sharply one day before my final tests. My parents kicked me out of our house after accusing me of something unimaginable. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I belonged to a really well-knit family. In their own way, My parents were affectionate but rigorous, always urging my sister Lisa and me to be the best we could be. They had great expectations of us. Beautiful, intelligent, and accomplished, Lisa was the golden child. She had everything going for her, including Brad, her amazing husband, who appeared to be the ideal fit. They married young, and although they first moved out, Brad found himself back at our family house after finding a job nearby. Both of my parents were ecstatic. They loved having them around, and in a sense, I did as well. In spite of our ongoing comparisons, happy to have Lisa close, I looked up to her. For my part, I was still in college, and my parents greatly controlled my life. My school was close by. Thus, they closed it right away when I recommended living in a dorm for more freedom. You could remain here. Thus, why would you waste money on a dorm? They would say, though, that it was about control rather than only financial saving. Knowing where I was, who I was with, and always what I was doing appealed to them. I persuaded myself it was because they cared deeply. Yet I knew it was stifling. Living with Lisa and Brad, our house was always bustling. We felt as though we were all crowded together attempting to negotiate adult life while still under treatment like children. Treating Brad nearly like the son they never had, my parents showed him love. To anyone who would listen, they would flaunt him, and it was abundantly evident that he could not do anything wrong in their view. On the other hand, I paid my sister's spouse little thought. Listening to how proud my parents were of him, he had grown arrogant. Though he knew well that it was my parents' wish, he would often wonder why I wasn't living in the college dorms. In general, my parents' opinions were one. Those of my sister and her spouse on my life decisions also matter. I was also trying to juggle my academics, a part-time job, and a long-distance relationship with my boyfriend Mark, who was enrolled in another state. Like I was compared to Lisa my whole life, my parents barely paid attention to him. Today, we treat Mark similarly, that is, by contrasting him with Brad. Though they never said it explicitly, their disdain of him was evident in the way they discounted him whenever I mentioned it. I attempted to keep the peace even with the strain. I would make supper, assist out around the house, and try to keep out of Lisa and Brad's path. Though our relationship was friendly, Lisa and I were never really close. Her life was occupied, and I was concentrated on my academics. Hence, our interactions were few and restricted to courteous chats and the sporadic family supper. Conversely, Brad was always nice and treated me more like a young sister than merely his sister's sibling. We got along nicely, and I valued having someone who seemed not to criticize me the way my parents did. But one day out of nowhere, everything changed. Just before my finals, my parents invited me into the living room with austere attitudes. I was anxious and tired from studying. I felt a hole in my stomach right away since they claimed to have something significant to talk about. Saying they had come across some messages on my phone, presumably proving I was trying to sleep with Brad, they looked at me with disappointment and fury. Wife of my sister. I was utterly blindsided. They showed me these so-called books, but they were obviously made up and somewhat out of context. I tried to clarify that I never, ever would consider Brad in that manner. He was to me like a brother. Besides, I loved my own guy with all my heart, but they wouldn't listen. It felt as though all the trust we had developed over years vanished in an instant. They ordered that I leave the house right away and charged me with trying to ruin Lisa's marriage. I urged them to let me speak with Brad throughout this exchange, but Brad evidently was too disturbed by everything to have a conversation with me somewhere else. Desperate and crying, I phoned my grandparents. I shared with them all that had happened, showing them the actual messages proving I was being wrongly accused and showing no interest in Brad. Always gentle and compassionate, my grandparents believed me without second thought. They welcomed me, housed me, and helped me through the worst of my life. Still, my dad was enraged. My remaining with them and not teaching a lesson annoyed him. He stormed my grandparents' house one day when I wasn't home, accusing them of indulging me and so compromising his authority. My grandpa and grandma defended me. The debate stopped when my father stormed out, pledging never to talk to them ever once more. Seeing the family split apart this way hurt my heart. Thinking that none of this would have happened without me visiting my grandparents made me feel guilty. The unthinkable then occurred, though. My grandfather died out of nowhere. It was devastating. In my life, I had never experienced such anguish. More importantly, though, was that my parents skipped his burial. With my boyfriend's support, I was barely hanging on and attempting to run everything. And on top of that, I had to tend to my totally devastated granny. Her own kid had left her in her hour of need, and her spouse was gone. A few days later, suddenly, my parents arrived at my grandparents' place. Seeing them just served to highlight all the rage and suffering I had been attempting to suppress while still in mourning. They grudgingly said they were out of the city when I asked them why they hadn't shown up for the burial. But I knew the real story. They were on leisure travel. I kept quiet, even though my cousin told me everything after seeing their postings, restraining my want to face them. My boyfriend Mark was visiting with us for a few days at the time as well, supporting my grandmother and myself through the tragedy. My dad called just as he was leaving to see my parents. As if Mark's presence bothered them, they questioned me why he was there. That touched a chord with me. While my parents were gone having fun, neglecting their duties, I have been keeping things together, organizing the burial, helping my grandmother, and handling my own loss. Looking at my father, who seemed totally unconcerned about the damage he had done, I felt a flash of wrath. I asked him who he felt had handled all the funeral preparations, who had made sure everything went well, and who had been with my grandmother when she most needed her family. Though he had been nowhere around us, leaving me to pick up the fragments of our broken family, ideally, it was supposed to be him, the son who should have taken care of these things. Dad objected quite strongly from there, clearly upset that I would challenge him. He scowled at me and advised me to be careful as if I were still the compliant youngster he could manage. But I was not that person anymore. Then his whole attitude changed practically out of nowhere. His eyes' fury vanished, and an uncomfortable calm took front stage. Speaking softly and declaring he wasn't here to fight, he became the most composed person in the room. He insisted he wanted to let things go and start again. As if that were something I needed forgiven for, he even said he was coming to pardon me for what had happened with Brad. Then he said he wanted something of his own, but he would let me stay here with Granny. I was startled. He was reminding me to check my tone a moment ago, and today he was discussing forgiveness and moving on from the past. It made no sense, and I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling I had. Then it suddenly struck me. Here he was, to inherit something. He was now coming for money after everything he had put Grandpa through, following the desertion and the treachery. Making apologies or repairing our damaged friendship piqued little interest for him. He sought what he believed to be his. Whichever damage he had inflicted, he felt he was entitled to something. He was unaware, though, that Grandpa knew exactly what he was driven by. Grandpa, bless his soul, he had looked after everything a day following the death. We came upon a message buried in one of Grandpa's drawers as we began cleaning his room. Said simply, "Give Bob a call." Bob was an old friend of Grandpa's lawyer, someone who had visited several times in the past, though at the time I hardly gave it much thought. Bob told us when we got in touch that Grandpa left behind a will, meticulously choosing who would inherit what. In retrospect, Dad's timing was practically perfect, now that I think about it. He seemed to be wanting to stake his claim before the will was brought up, as though he knew it would be discussed shortly. Still, I have to admit that telling him I knew exactly what he was searching for made me very happy. He had not come to restore our fractured family, reconcile, or even provide any actual forgiveness. No, he came here for Grandpa, savings for the money he felt belonged rightly to him. But that was not going to happen. Grandpa had made sure of that with a combination of calmness and determination. I informed Dad that Grandpa had left all the money in my name. Every last bit of savings he had accrued now belonged to me to handle. Grandpa had signed the house over to Grandma, so she would always have a roof over her head, safe from anyone who would try to steal it from her. At first, I had intended to announce this when the dust had settled, maybe when we could gather as a family and have a civil conversation on things. Perhaps in another universe we could have worked out some means to respectfully and sympathetically balance Grandpa's last desires. But that prospect disappeared the instant Dad entered the house with his entitled demeanor, thinking he could harass and control his path to acquire what he wanted. I watched the shock and incredulity flash across his face when I mentioned the will. He was mute for a moment, not understanding that everything he had been depending on was no more within his reach. But suddenly, just as fast as the astonishment had started, rage took front stage. Being such a narcissist, he thought he had always been there for his parents. He charged me with lying and with pushing Grandpa into changing, as if I had somehow coordinated all of this. The irony was nearly ridiculous. He accused me of being manipulative when he had left his family behind in quest of his selfish avarice. Still, I persisted. I said that Bob the attorney could confirm every word I was stating since Grandfather had made these choices on his own long before he died. There was no hidden agenda to exclude him or any conspiracy. Grandpa had just realized where my parents' priorities lay, and he behaved to save his wife and granddaughter, the most dear things to him. Dad's rage only deepened as the reality of things sank in. As Grandpa's son, he tried to persuade me that I should turn over the money to him since it was rightly his. But I was not persuaded. He already made decisions, and those decisions had results, I told him. He was now reaping what he had decided to ignore his obligations and abandon his father. Mom, who had likewise been silent up until this point, also stepped up, begging me to change course and figure out some way to right things, but it was already too late. She likewise didn't respond very nicely. She said, I recall, things like, "Wasn't it enough? I wanted Lisa to suffer too, after trying to grab her happiness." There was no turning back. They had displayed their real colors. Grandpa had decided, and I meant to respect his choice. The strain in the room was almost intolerable as they left. Feeling both relief and sadness, I watched them go. Sadness since Grandfather had shielded us even in his absence. So my relationship with my parents had reached a stage whereby there was no possibility of reconciliation and relief. Over the next few days, I concentrated on ensuring Grandma knew she was not alone and on adjusting to life without Grandpa looking after her. Mark stayed with us to offer the comfort and support we both required through such trying circumstances. Although the loss of Grandpa still hurt, there was comfort in the knowledge that his last desires were being honored. Then, right when I felt the dust had at last cleared, a letter showed up in the mail. It was directed to me from Bob, Grandfather's attorney. Opening it, hoping for some last information regarding the will or even a note of condolence, I discovered something quite unexpected. Grandpa had created a trust fund in my name, according to the letter. Not surprising at all was this. I already knew of his leftover savings for me. The demand that accompanied it, though, threw me off guard. The trust was connected to a Florida piece of land Grandpa had silently bought years ago. The letter states that the property was to stay under my ownership with one restriction. Should my parents try to challenge the will or pursue any legal claim on Grandpa's inheritance, the property would immediately pass to them along with the money connected to it. The turn is that the property was nothing more than the finances and a dilapidated old house far from the opulent bequest my parents would have anticipated. For a property of size, they were barely sufficient to cover maintenance and taxes. Stunned, I sat there realizing Grandpa had laid a trap for my parent in addition to expected avarice. Should they want to subvert the will, they would inherit a financial load that would sap them dry, not merely lose. A few days later, Bob called me. He told me my parents had actually sought to challenge the will, convinced they could somehow collect the fortune they felt rightly theirs. They had engaged a lawyer and intended to bring the case before court. Bob patiently and methodically clarified to me that the trust would take over, and the Florida property and all related expenses would become theirs as soon as they submitted the papers. Not out of concern, the news hit me like a blow to the gut. Though I knew they wouldn't succeed, it was exactly what Grandpa had seen. He knew, even in his latter days, that my parents would reach this point driven by their avarice, and now they were approaching the trap he had set for them straightforwardly. The court case started, and it was obvious right away that my parents had no chance. Bob had checked that everything was in order. The will was airtight. Blinded by their need for money, my parents persisted nonetheless, believing they could somehow reverse Grandpa's last intentions. Then that day, the court dismissed their case. The Florida land, together with its financial load, became formally theirs once the trust kicked in. Naturally, they were enraged when they realized too late that the exact individual they had sought to turn on had outwitted them. From a distance, I saw as they tried to sell the house and discovered that no one wanted to pay for a deteriorating old house with a mound of debt attached. Their financial situation rapidly sank, and they discovered they were caught in a quagmire they created. It was, in a sense, the perfect poetic justice. Grandpa had been able to shield Grandmother and me from their avarice, even from beyond the tomb. And even if I never enjoyed their agony, I couldn't help but find closure. They had taken decisions and now had to deal with the fallout. My dad is now irate, but instead of backing down, he started asking for my pardon, claiming he was only misinterpreted and that they only wanted what was fair. He tried to present himself as the victim. In an attempt to sweet-talk me about everything, my mother has also been regularly dropping texts and voice messages. She describes how families struggle but always find their way back to one another, how Grandpa would want us to be together, and how she simply wants the past behind us. Clearly, though, their deeds speak louder than their words, and they haven't really changed. Reconciliation piques no interest among them. Finding a way back into the money they lost interests them. Worse still, they have Lisa and Brad hooked into their plot. My sister and her husband are now reaching out to me in an attempt to be peacemakers. They are discussing family and how we should stay together and are acting in all the correct manner. Still, I see through it. All of it fits the game. Lisa, who had not spoken to me since the charge, is suddenly behaving as though she values restoring our connection. If they can guilt me sufficiently, they all want me to cave in and give them a bit of the trust fund. They are attempting to wear me down, so I would feel as though I am the one dragging the family behind. That I'm to blame. We are all somewhat divided, and for the first time I really find myself perplexed. Part of me wants to retain my ground, to preserve what grandfather left for me, not let them control me once more as well. Another side of me, though, questions whether I should try to forgive and figure out some direction forward, though I am aware of their far from pure motivations. Credit Aita then for wanting to hang on to what grandfather left me, even if it meant distancing myself from my family. Alternatively, should I strive to forgive them knowing full well that their motivations could not be as pure as they claim? One day or two following my folks' visit, surprisingly quiet everything was. It felt as though at least the drama could at last be ended, even if there was no possibility for reconciliation. I let myself unwind a little, hoping they had at last embraced the circumstances and gone on. Deep down, though, I knew it was too wonderful to be true. The peace prior to the tempest. Sure enough, I got an email from my dad just as I began to think things would remain quiet. The message had a terrible tone. He was more than just enraged. He was flaming with entitlement and hatred. He said he knew all of Grandpa's money belonged rightly to him, and that I was only a robber keeping it from him. He continued on about how I ought to be a decent human being and how I should have done the right thing by turning everything over to him. Then, as if to exacerbate the issue, he brought up the brat matter once more and said he would kindly pardon me for what I did should I give him the money. If I did not, though, I would suffer dire repercussions, not only with his words, but also with his willingness to go great distances. It was startling. The email made me ill to my stomach and was a direct threat. These days, this goes beyond simply financial considerations. This was about control, power, and his need to rule everyone around him, even if it meant sacrificing his own daughter in the course of things. As if that wasn't enough, I began to get calls from distant cousins, friends, and family concerning the various rumors my parents had been disseminating. Calling me a husband stealer, they suggested I was some sort of devious gold digger who had sought to destroy Lisa's marriage. It was also mildly humorous, since what gold were they referring to? Brad decided it would be less expensive to live with his in-laws, and although I did not criticize him previously, I was definitely doing that now. Though the lies were painful, what really offended me was their low willingness to stoop. They sought to discredit me by portraying me as the villain in their warped narrative. They seemed to be priming me to be the evil man. If they said it enough times, people would come to believe it. Knowing I couldn't manage this on my own, I called Bob, Grandpa's attorney, to find out what I could do. I emailed him outlining all that had been happening. Bob was composed and reassuring when we chatted, but he did not sugarcoat the circumstances. Sadly, he warned me, my dad could try to bring the case to court. Legally, he had the right to challenge the will, particularly if he was alleging that Grandpa was forced or not of sound mind when he made his decisions. Though it was a weak case, if Dad chose to proceed, it would be sufficient to send us into a protracted legal struggle. Bob stated the good news was, Dad had little ground to stand on. Grandpa's will was strong, and we had enough proof to prove he was completely conscious and in charge when he made judgments. Still, A court case loomed over me like a black cloud. The stress, the legal bills, and the possibility for additional falsehoods and defamation were enough to make me feel imprisoned, even if Dad had a compelling case. I'm tired, angry, and hurt. It seems like they will pursue me constantly no matter what I do. My parents were meant to be the ones that had my back no matter what, and who encouraged me? Rather, they were the ones undermining me, seeking to remove the stability and protection Grandpa had so laboriously earned for me. Here I am then, getting ready for whatever is ahead. Should this get to court, I have begun compiling all the paperwork and proof I could need. Every communication, every email, every call my parents send me. Now I also keep a record of. Bob said that might all be crucial if we had to prove intent to defame or harassment of me. Still, there is a small part of me that questions occasionally if I should keep battling this war or whether there is a point when I should simply turn away. Perhaps this would all be over if I let them have their preferences. Again, though, what sort of message would that transmit? That, should they simply push hard enough, they can take whatever they want? I am still keeping my ground for this single reason. With luck, our future presents better opportunities. When something happens, I will let you folks know. Still to come. Bye-bye. Hello, everybody. Past few days. What has happened? I most certainly did not notice it approaching. One morning, entirely out of the blue, Lisa dropped by our door, ready for her to toss whatever allegation she could at me. I was getting ready for a confrontation. But what I saw was a broken lady, not wrath. She looked worn out. Her eyes were red from tears. Before I could even probe what went wrong, her whole body shook as she struggled to talk through the emotions and broke into tears. She related to me what had transpired. Her husband Brad had been on an apparent business trip, trying to surprise him. Lisa made the unannounced visit to him. She entered on him with another woman. Nevertheless, when she arrived at his motel, she could not manage the shock, the treachery. It was too much. She confronted him straight away, yelling at him, demanding responses, asking how he could have done this to her. In the furnace of the moment, she hurled every charge she could conceive at him, including the one that had split our family apart. Ever believed I was flirting with him. Brad then eventually stated the truth, hoping to save whatever meager dignity he still has. Not me, was it? Never me too. Lisa had seen books that had made her accuse me of wanting to take her husband, but these were really from one of his several flings. To evade suspicion, he had under my name saved the woman's number. He felt it was ingenious, a perfect approach to hide his traces. But Lisa leaped to the worst conceivable conclusion when she saw the messages, therefore undermining all that was said. My head was whirling while Lisa was telling me all the misery, all the anguish, all the devastation one man's falsehoods had done. Like a dagger turning in my chest all over again, the knowledge that my parents had believed him turned against me without even thinking about the fact that I might be innocent. But the next thing Lisa told me was much more terrible. She had gone to her parents, expecting them to be by her side as she negotiated the mess her marriage had created after learning of Brad's treachery. Rather than comfort, though, they advised her to make it work with Brad, as if his adultery was only a small hitch on the path. They really persuaded her to forgive him, to let it go, and to go on with life. Their daughter's happiness paled second to their need to keep appearances. They were ready to compromise Lisa's welfare in order to maintain the impression of a flawless family, since they wanted the shame of a divorce in the family avoided. Hearing this, I struggled with pity and wrath. That our parents could be so heartless, so blind to what their children were going through, infuriated me. But I also became rather depressed for Lisa. She had gone through so much, and rather than the help she sorely needed, she was under pressure to remain in a poisonous relationship for appearances. Lisa began apologizing, saying she was sorry for everything, for not trusting me, for allowing Brad and our parents to control her, and she claimed she had no idea what to do anymore or who else to ask. She was alone, caught, and utterly lost. What to say to her eluded me. Part of me wanted to yell, to remind her that her choices had resulted in this, that she had decided to believe falsehoods about her own sister. Still, another side of me wanted to cuddle her and assure her we would work things out together. That day, we spoke for hours. By the end of it, I understood things would never be the same between us. but I also understood that right now, more than ever, we both needed each other. Grandma assured Lisa she could stay with us as long as she wished. Regarding our parents, I'm not sure what the future holds. Given that the truth about Brad has surfaced, I wonder if their tune will alter, since all of their machinations derived from this. Let's see the following development. Though the emotional scars remain raw, things have started to calm down. Lisa still finds it difficult, not surprisingly, after all she has gone through, but we have begun researching divorce proceedings for her to ensure she is totally apart from Brad. Though it takes time, this is a required step for her to begin recovery. Positively, on a more positive note, at last my parents carried out what they ought to have done long ago. They tossed Brad from their house. He is not visiting there anymore, and quite honestly, that's a relief. Though it's annoying that it took them this long to recognize the truth, at least it's at last happening. Unexpectedly, Dad actually contacted Grandma and apologized for everything he missed during Grandpa's funeral due to his absence. He reassured Grandma that he wanted to make up for it and attempt to undo the damage he had done by treating me and the stress he put on all of us. Grandma, though, was exact with him. She reminded him that although his apology was polite, it did not change the fact he lacked the house or income. The fact that Dad embraced this without question really startled me. Though I remained dubious about his intentions, it felt like a minor triumph. Grandma mentioned something significant only one day ago. She said she wanted to check her will was in order. She has not yet told the rest of the family, but she confided in me that she intends to give the house to Lisa. This is, I believe, a wise move. After all Lisa has gone through, she deserves something solid and significant. Participating in our grandparents' legacy might bring some solace for her. Looking back, all that has transpired has caused me to reinterpret family. It transcends mere blood or custom. It's about the people who support you through trying circumstances and who believe in you even when others do not. Though I might never have the same relationship with my parents, I'm good with it. I have my sister, Granny, and the help of those really dear to me. Read it. This could be the last 1 cent. Though things are far from perfect, everyone is headed forward. Lisa is beginning to reconstruct her life, and even if it's only a small bit, I hope my parents might at last be changing. Time will tell whether they truly mean it or whether this is merely another chapter in a long series of disappointments. Right now, though, we are all trying our best. That is all I can truly ask for. Though I know I haven't spoken enough, I am immensely appreciative of all of your counsel and encouragement. I wouldn't have come this far without your remarks. I appreciate your greatly boosting my confidence. Farewell. Story 4. Niece stated her dad told her, "I'm like a girl since I cook and clean," and called me a slur. My whole family turned against me when I insisted on an apology. My wife, 30F, and I, 29M, have 2 children, 5 a.m. and 3 a.m. While I work from home with somewhat flexible hours, my wife spends a full day in an office job. Basically, nobody really cares what time of day I work outside of certain Zoom meetings or how many hours it takes as long as I fulfill my deadlines. Let's call her Barb, my sister, 26F. Her husband, 30M, let's call him Nick. Work full-time and live close by. 5 of their daughters are F. Given her convenient work schedule, let's call her Tracy. We essentially determined when our children started attending nursery that I would be dropping off and bringing up my niece from nursery along with our own. I thought it was fantastic for my children to spend time with her cousin, so I wasn't particularly bothered. I always thought of myself as Tracy's cool uncle and got along with her too. She is a sweetheart who typically behaves well. Still, most days I bring my kids and her back to our house. I make them dinners or snacks. My sister comes to take them up in the afternoon, evening. I was making snacks with my 3-year-old when the 5-year-old children were viewing Bluey on TV a few days ago. I heard yelling. My son was screaming at her that my dad's not a girl when I hurried over to check what was going on. My initials back are lefties? That's like a female. Although the word is different in my language, the message is clear since it distinguishes using it from just addressing a gay person. Initially in disbelief, I switched off the TV and sat her down to start explaining that this is a very negative word and we shouldn't be calling people that. Still, I'm not a girl, thus she should apologize to me since we don't treat each other in this family. And this is a negative term. And should I hear this once more, I will discuss it with her parents since she will face consequences. She said she won't get in trouble as her dad phoned me. and he's not in trouble. I looked shocked. She should apologize regardless, I told her, even if her dad thought otherwise. It's a very negative word, and she should not use it with me or in my presence. She followed this as she is a quite decent child. We spoke further, and I pushed her about other things her parents mentioned, and from what I know, extracting information from a 5-year-old being is clearly challenging and untrustworthy. Cooking is a woman's responsibility, as my BL reminded Tracy's sister and Nick. Men shouldn't be sitting at home all day and doing childcare, and frankly, most of the things I do around my house and that I am a female. Given that my wife makes more money than I do and I help around the house, I see this as not really a man's. I told her that my wife Barb and I thought men and women might work from an office or from home, the best I could explain. Working long hours from the office does not make the guys and vice versa. But since it's not really her fault, I didn't linger on it with her. I anticipated it would be a difficult topic, so I didn't bring it up right away with my sister. I also didn't want to have it in front of the kids, and I wanted to speak it over with my wife first too. That evening, I did speak with my wife, and she appeared to be somewhat agitated as well. She agreed when I told her I should insist Nick and my sister apologize. When I informed my sister what happened, she said that it's only a word and I'm exaggerating. And Nick certainly doesn't hate me. I said, I don't give a damn if he likes or hates me. She seems very cool about this rather than defending me. And he is talking trash about me behind my back, to my niece and her. That's how Nick was, she continued. And I ought to quit being a drama queen. She could pick up her own child from creche and hang up if that was how she felt. I advised her to curse. Although I knew it was quite short notice and nasty, I truly felt like folks I had done so much for over the years were disrespecting me and my family. According to my wife, she understood and advised me not to back down until at least I received a sincere apology. The next 2 days were a weekend, and there was no creche. Though I thought Barb would be calling or texting, there was nothing. Actually, the odd absence of any calls or messages made me consider she dismissed my word as not very important, and this truly infuriated me further. When Tracy needed to be picked up for creche, the calls did come. I clearly missed them. I dropped off my own children and didn't even respond for some time. Though I knew it was petty, I was stewing for 2 days and believed that letting Barb stew for a few hours would be just acceptable. When she called once again about midday, I did pick up. I meant to smugly tell her I was ready for an apology and we would go on, but I never got to say it. Rather, she started criticizing me about my irresponsibility, flaking, and late arrival for work resulting from my actions. I said to you, I wasn't going to pick her up. I hung up once more since you had 2 days to organize, and she continued to shout at me. She kept phoning and texting me about picking Tracy up from creche, to which I responded I would not be. Stop responding after that. Tracy was expecting me to take her as well when I arrived to pick my kids up, so it was rather difficult for her and me both. Like, she's 5, and she abruptly doesn't get to go over to our place and play and have snacks. It's not her fault. At the same time, though, I didn't want to let this pass without protest. Like I still do, I felt I deserved an apology. I said then that her mother and I were fighting, but I would pick her up once we worked things out. She clearly didn't take it well since she's 5, but I apologized, picked her kids, and left. Well, somewhat later, I received a call from my mother. My mom is disabled, so she was having a really difficult time with Tracy and asked me why I was being nasty to Barb. Barb hooked her into picking up Tracy. I told her everything, expecting her to sidekick me, but instead she also pulled a, you know how Nick is, to which I responded that the more I realize how Nick is, the less I like it. And sure as curse isn't going to be doing free labor for him if he believes all this crap generally and about me specifically. I told her I wasn't the one blowing this all out of proportion since all I asked for was a freaking apology, and everyone else seemed to prefer all of this crap to just delivering it to me. She advised me to simply be the larger man and not let it affect me. I said I was done and had fun with Tracy. That evening, I received a call from Nick personally, which I was reluctant about, but I decided to answer out of chance should I be about to offer that apology. No, apparently, Barb's family is suffering enormous misery from my actions. And how should I treat my own sister? Since we are family, I asked him how he could talk trash about me to his child, which I look after every day, and he added, He was just having fun, and it was all lighthearted. I wanted to apologize. I told him it wasn't pleasant nor good for me. Blowing up on me, he called me a crazy young girl and told me I was obese and unable to laugh. I hung up and advised him to curse. I was done with him. I missed a lot of calls from Barb and my mother resulting from this. Barb texted me that it wasn't fair for Tracy to pay the price of her parents being unappreciative bits of garbage, and I told her that it wasn't fair for Tracy to pay for me being petty. She basically yelled at me a lot about how she was going to lose her job, and I was treating Mom and her badly. I informed her I was done. I will be blocking her number unless her next message was an apology. It wasn't. I am so blocked by her right now. My mother has been taking Tracy for a few days. It has been rather difficult seeing her in creche and explaining that Grandma's going to pick her up, which she hates. She has told me she isn't having fun with Granny and wants to come over to our place, and it breaks my heart as well. However, I never received a single apology from anyone except the 5-year-old at the same moment, so I feel that letting this go would just be allowing my family to disrespect my limits. I do, however, love my niece at the same time, and I wish not to traumatize her or cause her to resent me. She is a good kid. None of it is her fault. So Aita, what then do I do? Edit, holy shit. You people barely woke up for hours, and I am already so appreciative of all your help and guidance. Though now I think it may have value, and it worries me greatly for Barb. The perspective of Nick truly wanting her to quit her work is not what I thought. I also find myself not very active at the same time, till she at least admits Nick is just that. Thus, stopping overreaction won't fly with me. I also guess it's just a matter of time till my mother is no more a choice. She is already struggling, thus I expect to have a chance to discuss it with her, preferably since she will see my point of view. But given her need, I'll settle with, I'm not sure what kind of childcare they can afford. They borrowed a big mortgage on a house they could hardly afford. Tracy should also be reminded of me loving her. None of this is her fault. I appreciate everyone. Right, November 13th, 2024. All right, so I wrote this yesterday and was really overwhelmed by the comments, guidance, and encouragement. I appreciate everyone. I feel this calls for a revision. To clear a few things up, we weren't really surprised when my dad passed from a heart attack 2 years ago, as he smoked a lot and led a rather poor lifestyle. Neither was it his first either. Before then and right up to the very end, he was a wonderful grandpa and dad. But his death left my mother alone and unemployed. My mom goes through now, and her MS is essentially consistent, but gradually grows worse over time and flares up periodically. Stress makes her worse. Usually, a flare-up results in her returning level not being quite what it was prior. We so generally aim to keep her tension-free. Her house is paid for, and my dad had life insurance. Hence, she had some money. She cannot afford, though, a carer, visiting 3 times a week to clean, cook, shop, etc. My wife and I pay for such. As I indicated in a comment on the first post, finally, my wife and I are doing most likely better than Barb and Bill. Though they have a nice house and nice cars, they have debt, including a mortgage. The excellent response I received made me consider this crap once more, and it made me consider how I could take my position without completely giving up on Tracy, and realize there was no ideal option, and I had to pick something. I simply needed to process and handle this garbage. Hence, I missed work today. One remark on the original piece truly spoke to me regarding how someone would feel in Tracy's place. I simply cannot do it to her now. Though I know this isn't the revision some of you have been looking for, I just can't. Like she is one of my own and my children do, I love her like she is. And she is not to blame. I unblocked my sister since clearly she needs to be able to reach me if I am going to be engaging with her kid. During the day, I spoke with my mother and she once more became upset about having to pick Tracy up. Pretty difficult for her. I told her I was ready to help, but I'm visiting, and she will have to hear me out. She agreed to which. I spoke with her for a long time, avoiding snark and lashing out this time and simply explaining that essentially, Nick's level of seriousness or behavior doesn't really matter. I relate that to rocking the boat. Someone connected in comments emphasized my point by stating that it makes no difference whether or not I was right in becoming offended. Being her child, if something disturbs her, it at least justifies giving me the benefit of the doubt before pointing against me. And then it seemed to show through. She apologized, We hugged it out, and I believe she understood. She usually strives to keep the peace and is not a particularly aggressive person, so this time she went about it incorrectly. She's my mother, thus I'm not stating I'm crazy, but she apologized. She was open to my explanation that she shouldn't be covering for me, as it means I have no leg to stand on when confronting Nick and Barb. I told my sister we needed to talk, and I'll drop Tracy off at their house tonight. I got a stoic thumbs up. Tracy came out of nursery today and was ecstatic. She was actually a little possessive of me remaining by my side all afternoon instead of rushing off to play, which was cute, but also made me feel like shit a little since that impacted me not picking her up. I told her, as best of my knowledge, she is not in trouble, and I am not upset with her, but I am angry with her parents, and we have to get things out. She was very delighted when I tried to stop taking her up, though, so I'll do my best not to stop. I dropped her off in the evening, then sat down to chat with Barb and Nick once she was in bed. Mom wasn't going to be covering for them longer. I told them straight out, if they didn't let me finish what I had to say, I would get up and walk out, and they can figure out fresh Tracy's schedule. Though they don't need to know, I meant nothing. Though not delighted, they were open to listening. That is hence development. Perhaps at least the thread is working. I clarified that this was the current circumstance. Now I don't need them to mean their apologies, but I sure as heck was going to need one. This was now the main focus. I spent years raising their child. If they wanted to be arseholes, I wouldn't have done it for free. This is thus how it currently stands. 1. I am not dropping her off in the morning till more notice. Nick's behavior lacked justification. Hence, it had to have some long-lasting effect. 2. I was no longer going to be funding family holidays and outings. Supporting his family fell under a man's responsibility. Thus, luck with it is really favorable. Tracy is the exception. She is always greeted kindly. 3. Should I hear any more BS talking about me behind my back? I was going to start billing them for my work. My intention was to restore the thing they wanted, childcare, dangle it, but simultaneously inflict some consequences and threat of things becoming difficult for them once more. I also put it on really heavy about how I am a guy, so I clearly have pride and cannot have that be denigrated even by my own family, whom I obviously love. Though I hardly give Nick family much thought, I reasoned he wouldn't figure it out. This infuriated Nick, and my sister had to take him outside to cool things down without me. Eventually they agreed, and I received my somewhat half-hearted apologies. Though I could certainly take it further, I didn't want to chance having to either back down or damage Tracy once again. I took this then, though I get to walk away with what I wanted, giving them some revenge without having to sacrifice my time with Tracy. There were no tears or loving hugs. Though I still intend to discuss her relationship with Nick and her impressions of me with my sister alone, I should let things cool a bit before I do. Although I know this isn't the fix some of you might have in mind, ultimately, I have to figure something out I am able to live with, and personally, this is it. We will notify you should something change. Second narrative. 6 years ago, the wife chewed on something. I pardoned her, and all was good until my sister asked whether I wanted to live with someone who had deceived me. Hi, everyone. I married my wife 20 years ago, and we have a daughter, 18 years old. A few months ago, she finished high school. I discovered my wife was having an affair and cheating on me about 6 years ago. It lasted for a few months. Though my wife was quite regretful, I genuinely wanted to divorce. She called off from her employment. She began seeing a therapist. She promised all the stages of reconciliation I asked for. In the end, I did choose to stay with my wife for our family's benefit as well as for hers. Around 5 years. Actually, everything was going very nicely. We also truly loved each other, enjoyed romantic trips, and had date evenings. But in the 6th year, the whole affair came back to my mind, and I simply couldn't get my head off it. After a certain line from my sister really connected with me, I at last decided. She responded, "Would you really want to use your gift of life and share it with someone who had so terribly deceived you?" A few days before my daughter's graduation, she informed me. That's when I finally realized I couldn't keep on. I notified my wife of my choice and advised her that I would be filing for divorce shortly, one day before my daughter graduated. My wife assured me she would do anything, astonished and crying a lot, but I told her my decision was definite. The graduation of my daughter in itself was fantastic, and I was really proud of her. My wife appeared to be in good spirits as well, but my daughter asked me why she sensed something was wrong. Her mother appeared depressed and faking a smile. She should simply enjoy the day, I advised her, not stress about it. My daughter seemed surprised when I told her the next day that I would be seeking a divorce. She explained how I could treat her mother before graduation, which is why her mother missed the celebration. Though I told her it's none of her concern, we will always adore her anyhow. I am divorcing my wife right now. Ada said that her comments were up. Commenter first howdy. You may have waited several days. Furthermore, if you were happy, why did you permit that line from your sister to influence you so strongly? Do you find yourself readily swayed by others? Is the look of always having a flawless marriage really crucial to you? Isn't the goal to learn the other person and ourselves from ever deeper angles? It wasn't only that cue, and it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment event. For the past year or so, I was obsessing over it and consulting my sister. She advised me that it was at last time I put myself first. I deserved to be with someone who would always be there for me, someone who would love me without conditions, someone who would never turn on me. The second commenter, I would have waited a little until she graduated. Her graduation was ruined since you already waited so long, and her mother had to act happy. Your daughter took it up really obviously. She now learns the day after, which further disturbs her recall of that day. You're not the arsehole for choosing a divorce, but your timing was a bit arsehole-ish. Oops. Once I decided, I simply wanted to be open and truthful with my wife. Along with celebrating my daughter's graduation, a great weight had been taken off of my shoulders. The proudest day of my life was that of my daughter's graduation. Third commenter. Is your midlife crisis upon you? You forgave her? You had 6 years to wait. Made it with a young chick? These memories came back to life. Then you brought the divorce into the graduation. Your daughter will carry that with her always. Yes, YouTube is here. My daughter did have a quite wonderful time. And the graduation celebration turned out fantastic as well. We shot a lot of images, and I'm sure she will find great nostalgia for that day. But the next day I told my daughter about the divorce as she kept asking me about her mother's seeming depression. She desired the truth. Thus, soon after graduation, I did not really want to tell her the news, but I had no alternative. Naturally, my daughter was quite depressed about hearing it and even started crying. Still, divorce is inevitable in life, and both her mother's and my love for her remain. She is a college student now, and I have no doubt she will overcome it shortly, and I hardly have a midlife crisis or any other woman in mind. Not even looking to date, at least for the next few years. My family of origin and I first deserve my attention. Commenter forgets. It's difficult, but the timing was awful. Not family anarchy on her graduation day. Your daughter deserves happy memories. She'll always remember NSP in this. Change. October 26th, 2024. Last night, my daughter phoned me and said she stumbled across the post I had placed, and after reading my comments, she wondered how I could be so nasty to her mom. She then informed me she would be only low contact with me momentarily. I did tell her I would always be there for her, and I realize she is going through a lot, but I will respect her choice to go low contact. That's not very great news, but life does go on. Story 5. When I was just a little kid, I lost my mom. It wasn't something I could prepare for. One day I was with her in the kitchen, talking, playing, maybe just watching her as she went about her daily routine, cooking, cleaning, humming to herself. It was like any other day, ordinary and peaceful. But that moment, it all changed. Suddenly, she collapsed right in front of me. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. 1 minute, she was there, and the next, she was lying motionless on the floor. I remember freezing for a moment. I tried to wake her up, holding her hand, calling out to her, hoping she would just smile at me again. But nothing. She didn't respond. I felt helpless, lost, like the world had shifted under my feet. It wasn't long before my dad came home. He found us, me beside her crying, utterly confused, and immediately knew something was terribly wrong. He screamed her name, grabbed the phone, and dialed for help. I couldn't even fully process it. The scene was so frantic. Strangers rushed into our house, their faces blurry, their voices distant. They checked on me, making sure I was okay. I didn't care about myself, though. I just wanted my mom back. The paramedics worked quickly, but it was clear, even to my young mind, that my mom was gone. They confirmed it, right there in our kitchen. She was gone. I remember the way my dad crumbled. He wasn't just upset, he was broken, and it hit me like a wave of grief I didn't know how to deal with. The funeral was a blur. I stood there, beside my dad, staring at the casket, but everything felt far away, like I was watching it through a fog. I didn't really understand what death meant back then. I couldn't understand how someone so important could just disappear, and all the words of sympathy from people around us barely registered. All I could think about was how I would never see my mom again. That night, after the funeral, my dad came home, and he held me as if he might lose me too. We both cried, neither of us knowing how to move forward without her. It was the beginning of a long, painful journey of grief. We were both broken, and I wasn't sure how we were supposed to survive in a world without her. In the midst of our grief, my Aunt Sarah, Dad's sister, became our lifeline. She stepped in when my dad couldn't handle his own emotions. He retreated into himself, barely speaking. He was a shadow of the man he used to be. His only focus seemed to be surviving the day, and even that he did poorly. He'd go to work, come home, and drink. He didn't have the strength to help me through this, so Aunt Sarah did. Every morning, Aunt Sarah would pick me up and take me to school. She made sure I had everything I needed, packing my lunch with little notes that brought some comfort in those dark times. After school, she would help me with my homework, patiently sitting with me even when I couldn't focus. There was no expectation that I would snap out of it. She just made sure I wasn't alone in my pain. At night, when Aunt Sarah had to go home to her own family, our nanny would come to take care of me until Dad came back. Aunt Sarah had her own life to deal with, but for those first few months, she made me and my dad her priority. I don't know how she did it. She was exhausted, juggling her own family while trying to hold us together. But she did it, and I will always be grateful for her. Eventually, Aunt Sarah suggested that we start going to church. She believed it could help us find some peace and structure, and I agreed to give it a try. Around the same time, my school noticed the toll my grief was taking on me. My grades were dropping, and my teachers recommended I see a grief counselor. At first, I didn't think it would help, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I could have made. Talking to a therapist gave me a safe space to express all the feelings I didn't understand. I could talk about my sadness, the confusion, and even the anger I was feeling without worrying about hurting my dad. It helped me make sense of everything, and in some way, it helped me reconnect with my dad. As I learned to process my emotions, I could also be there for him, even if just a little. The days started to feel a bit more bearable, but the pain of losing Mom would never go away. As the days turned into months, life started to change in ways I never expected. My dad, the man I had looked up to for as long as I could remember, began to fade. After my mom's death, he became someone I didn't quite recognize anymore. The grief consumed him. There were days when he didn't leave the house at all. He would sit on the couch, drink until he passed out, and I could only watch as he withered away. I wanted to reach out to him, but I didn't know how. He was so lost in his own pain that he couldn't even see how much I needed him. It wasn't just his grief that affected me, though. It was the fact that he seemed to disappear into his own world, like I was no longer a priority. It was as though, in his sorrow, he forgot that he had a child to take care of too. And I felt that. I felt it in the empty spaces where my mom used to be, and I felt it in the way my dad would barely look at me. I know he loved me, but I needed him to show it. And yet, he was so far gone in his grief, he couldn't. That's when Aunt Sarah became our anchor. She was the one who picked up the pieces, not just for me, but for my dad too. She took over the role of making sure I was okay, both physically and emotionally. She made sure I ate, that I got to school, and that I didn't fall apart. She wasn't just an aunt. She was like a second mother to me during those months. She became my constant. I remember the days when she would drop me off at school, holding my hand as we walked through the parking lot. She'd smile at me and remind me that everything was going to be okay, even though I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Her life was full of its own challenges. She had a family of her own, a husband, kids to look after, but she always made sure we came first. I didn't know how she did it, but somehow, Aunt Sarah kept everything together. She would pick me up after school, help me with homework, and listen to my complaints without judgment. And then, when she couldn't be there, our nanny would take over. I didn't know it then, but Aunt Sarah was trying to give me a sense of normalcy. to help me feel safe when the world around me felt anything but. We had routines. We had moments where I wasn't just grieving, I wasn't always crying. I was being a kid again, even if only for a little while, but that didn't mean I was okay. The truth was, I was far from okay. I was carrying a burden of grief that I didn't know how to express. It weighed on me, even at school. My grades slipped and my teachers started asking questions. I couldn't focus. I couldn't bring myself to care. The loss of my mom was too big to comprehend, and my brain just shut down at times, unable to process it. That's when Aunt Sarah insisted that I see a grief counselor. She thought it would help, and I wasn't exactly opposed to it, but I wasn't sure what talking to a stranger would do. Still, I agreed. I wanted something, anything, that could help me understand what I was going through. It turned out to be one of the best things I did. The therapist was kind, patient, and understanding. For the first time since my mom's death, I felt like I had a space to just talk. I could let out the anger, the confusion, the sadness, without feeling like I was burdening anyone. She helped me untangle the mess of emotions swirling inside me and made me realize that it was okay to feel everything I was feeling. But even though talking about it helped, it didn't change the fact that my dad was still lost. Slowly, I began to realize something. He wasn't going to come back to me the way I wanted him to. The dad I had before was gone. His heart was still in pieces. And the longer he stayed locked in his grief, the harder it became for him to be the father I needed. I began to feel this deep sense of abandonment, even though I knew he was hurting too. It was like I was alone in this grief. He couldn't offer me the comfort I needed. He didn't have the energy to care for me in the way I had always relied on. And so, I turned to Aunt Sarah more and more. She was the one who held me up during those times when I thought I might collapse under the weight of everything. Then, one day, everything shifted again. My dad began dating. It wasn't anything serious at first. A few women came and went, but nothing seemed to stick. That was fine by me. I wasn't interested in him moving on. I just wanted him to be present in my life again, but I couldn't bring myself to care about who he dated or how serious it became. Until the day he brought her home. Her name was Leah. The moment she stepped through the door, I didn't like her. There was something about her demeanor that rubbed me the wrong way. She wasn't warm or kind like my mom had been. In fact, she seemed distant, critical, and more concerned with inspecting our house than actually getting to know me. It wasn't a good first impression. And it didn't help when I caught her eyeing the photos of my mom. Those photos were the only thing left of her. They had been in our living room for years. Mom's smiling face, frozen in time, was my only connection to her now. But Leah didn't see it that way. "I don't think these photos are appropriate," she said casually, as though she had every right to judge us. "If you're serious about this relationship, they need to go." I couldn't believe it. It felt like a slap in the face. My dad didn't even hesitate. Without asking me how I felt, he started packing up the photos, taking them off the walls and locking them away in the attic. I couldn't understand it. How could he let her do that? Why did her feelings matter more than mine? Those pictures weren't just photos. They were memories, pieces of my mom that I wasn't ready to let go of. But my dad didn't see it. He just followed her orders without question. That was the first sign that something was changing, and not for the better. As Leah started coming around more, it became clear that she wasn't just another casual girlfriend. She was sticking around, and with her came her 2 kids. They were loud, too loud. They barged into our home like they owned the place. No respect, no boundaries. They ran through the house, knocking things over, spilling food, and leaving their mess everywhere. At first, it seemed like they were just kids being kids, but I quickly saw that it wasn't just their wild behavior. It was the way they invaded my space, my life, and my home. I could deal with the noise, the mess, and the chaos if it was just once in a while, but this was different. They were there every time I came home. I'd try to retreat to my room for some peace, but they'd follow me in, touching my things, rifling through my personal space like they belonged there. One time, I caught one of them trying to take my favorite game without asking. I snapped at them, but it didn't seem to matter. Leah never said a word. She started telling me that I should be spending more time with her kids. "You need to be a good older brother," she'd say, as though her children were mine to look after. "They need someone to look up to, and you're their only big brother." I wasn't stupid. I could see what was really going on. She didn't want me bonding with them. She wanted me to be their free babysitter, someone to entertain them while she and my dad went out on their dates. I could tell by the way she asked me to keep them busy so she could have her adult time with my dad. I wasn't going to play that role. I wasn't going to pretend to be a family with them when I barely knew them, and even worse, when I didn't want to. I tried to talk to my dad about it. I told him how I felt about Leah and her kids, how I felt like my space was being invaded, and that I wasn't ready to just accept them as a new part of our family. I expected him to understand. I wanted him to understand, but instead he told me I needed to try harder. He told me I needed to give them a chance, that we were family, and family meant being together. He kept saying that I needed to stop being so distant and that it would help him, that it would make things easier. But nothing about it was easy. The more I tried to push myself to get along with them, the more I resented it. I didn't want to be forced into this new family dynamic. I wasn't ready to accept them. I wasn't ready to pretend that everything was okay. One night, after another visit with Leah and her kids, I retreated to my room. I didn't say a word to anyone. I didn't want to. I could hear the laughter from the other side of the door, Leah's kids running around, playing, while my dad and her laughed along with them. It felt like a world I no longer belonged to. Then Leah came knocking. She didn't just knock lightly, though. She banged on my door like she was trying to break it down. She started yelling through the door, demanding that I come out and spend time with her kids. I didn't open the door. I stayed silent, hoping she would go away, but she didn't. She stood there, shouting at me about how I needed to be a better brother and how I was being unfair to her kids. She accused me of being rude and distant, and then she said something that made my blood boil. "You need to be taught a lesson," she said, her voice cold and full of venom. My heart sank. I felt trapped. My dad wasn't saying anything. He wasn't stepping in to defend me. He wasn't even telling Leah to back off. It was like he didn't even care how I felt. I had never felt more alone in my own house than I did at that moment. When Leah finally left, the silence in the house was suffocating. I waited for my dad to come and talk to me. I thought maybe he'd apologize. Maybe he'd see how out of line Leah had been, but no. When he came into my room, it wasn't an apology I got. Instead, he told me I was at fault. He said that Leah was a good woman and that I was the one making everything difficult. I tried to explain how I felt. I told him I wasn't the problem. I didn't have anything against Leah or her kids, but I didn't want to be forced into a relationship with them. I reminded him that I had just lost my mom. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to just move on and pretend everything was fine. But he didn't listen. Instead, he told me that for the sake of our family, I needed to at least try to get along with them. For me, he said, as if his happiness depended on me accepting Leah and her kids, he wasn't asking. He was telling me I couldn't believe it. It was like I didn't matter anymore, not really. All of this, the hurt, the resentment, the anger, it was all on me to fix because he was happy with Leah, because she made him feel good. The next week, my dad did something that would change everything. He told me we were going to family counseling. I had no idea why. I didn't think anything could fix what was broken. But my dad, Leah, and I were all going. I felt like I was walking into a trap. The whole thing felt like they were ganging up on me, all so they could force me into accepting Leah's family. But I didn't have a choice. The family counseling session felt like it had been set up from the start to make me the villain. From the moment we walked into that sterile room, I knew something wasn't right. The counselor smiled at us, trying to set the tone like everything was fine. I could tell Leah had been preparing for this, her fake smile and rehearsed lines ready to go. She kept talking about how she just wanted to be accepted, how her kids needed to be accepted as part of the family. She even started to cry, pouring on the emotion like she had been wronged. I couldn't stand it. It felt like a manipulation, a performance. And I wasn't buying it. When the therapist turned to me and asked how I felt, I couldn't believe it. It was the first time anyone had actually asked for my side of things. I felt like I had been suffocating under the weight of my dad's demands, of Leah's expectations, and no one had bothered to listen to me. I told the therapist exactly what I had told my dad. I didn't want a deeper relationship with Leah or her kids. I wasn't ready to just accept them into my life, especially when I still hadn't processed my grief, when I was still mourning the loss of my mom. I thought that was fair. I didn't want to be rude, but I didn't want to fake a bond either. I could be polite and civil, But anything beyond that, anything deeper, wasn't going to happen. Not right now. Leah wasn't happy with that. She immediately jumped in, her voice growing louder as she insisted that her kids deserved more than that. She told me I needed to stop grieving and move on, that I was holding everyone back by not letting go of my mom's memory. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Move on. How could she say that? How could she just erase the years I spent with my mom? The love I had for her. To her, it was like my grief was an inconvenience. Like I was supposed to just forget and welcome her family with open arms. I felt a surge of anger rising within me, and for the first time in a long time, I couldn't hold it in. But what hurt more was that my dad was sitting right there, nodding along with her. He actually agreed with Leah. He told me I needed to stop being stuck in the past and look forward to the future. He said that if I wanted a peaceful life, I needed to accept Leah and her kids. He didn't even consider how I felt, didn't even acknowledge that I was still hurting. It was like everything I had gone through didn't matter. What mattered was that he was happy with Leah, and if I wanted things to go back to normal, I had to be part of it. It was as though in his mind, Leah had become more important than me, more important than my mom. The man who had held me through my grief, who had promised to be there for me no matter what, was telling me to just get over it. That's when I realized that he wasn't the same person anymore. I wasn't even sure who he was anymore. The therapist, thankfully, wasn't swayed by their manipulation. She called them out. She pointed out that they were pushing me too hard, not giving me the space I needed to process my grief. She asked them to consider my perspective, to see things through my eyes. For once, someone was on my side. But Leah didn't take it well. She was furious. You could see it in her eyes, the way her face twisted with anger. On the drive home, she ranted about the therapist, calling her biased and accusing her of siding with me just because I was a kid. She blamed everything on me, as if I was the one making things difficult. And my dad, he didn't say a word. He just sat there, letting her go off. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell her to calm down. He just let her tear into me without saying anything. And then she crossed a line. She said something I will never forget. She said that my mom would be ashamed of me. She said that my mom would be disappointed that I was standing in the way of my dad's happiness. I snapped. I don't know where the words came from, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told her that I hated her. I told her I wished my dad had never met her. I screamed at her, telling her how cruel and manipulative she was. I let everything out, the anger, the frustration, the pain, and then I turned to my dad. I told him that he had chosen her over me, that he was letting her destroy our family. I reminded him that I was his son, that I had been there for him when my mom passed away, and now, when I needed him most, he was choosing her. His response, nothing. He didn't say anything to defend me. He didn't stand up for me. Instead, he just said that he was tired of the fighting. The worst part was when he grounded me. After all the things Leah had said, after everything that had happened, I was the one who got punished. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand how he could let me be treated like this and then ground me for it. The injustice of it all made me want to scream, but I didn't. I just went to my room, seething, feeling more alone than I had ever felt before. That night, I could hear my dad and Leah arguing. It was the same fight, over and over again. She was pushing him to choose. And he was. He was choosing her. A few days after the argument, my dad came to me with a look on his face that I couldn't quite read. He told me he needed to talk. I knew something wasn't right. My stomach dropped. I had been dreading this moment, but I never imagined it would go down like this. He sat me down and started talking about Leah again, about how much she meant to him, how they were building a future together. He even said that things would be better if I could just accept her and her kids. But then, he dropped the bombshell. He told me that I needed to leave. He told me I had to move out. I couldn't breathe. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My dad, the person I had always looked up to, the person who had promised me that we would get through anything together, was now telling me to leave. He said that he wanted a future with Leah, and that it couldn't happen with all the tension between us. He explained that I would go live with Aunt Sarah permanently, and that he would keep paying child support until I turned 18. But that was it. Once I turned 18, I was on my own. No more help, no more care. I was in shock. I couldn't wrap my head around it. My father, the man who I had spent my whole life looking to for guidance, had chosen a woman over his own son. He was willing to send me away for the sake of his relationship, as though I didn't matter anymore. It felt like a betrayal, like I was nothing more than an inconvenience in his life now. Aunt Sarah came to pick me up later that week. She had no idea how bad things had gotten. My dad had apparently kept everything hidden from her, trying to keep up the facade that everything was fine. When Aunt Sarah walked in and found out, she was furious. I had never seen her so angry. She stormed into the living room and started yelling at my dad, telling him that he was destroying our family. She told him that kicking me out was a decision he would regret forever, that he was making a mistake he couldn't undo, but it didn't matter. My dad didn't care. He just kept repeating that he deserved to be happy, that this was what he wanted. The argument went back and forth, but in the end, he wasn't going to change his mind. He wasn't going to choose me. I couldn't stop crying as Aunt Sarah grabbed my bags. I felt like my world was crashing down around me. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to believe that this was happening. But it was. My dad had made his choice and I wasn't part of it anymore. Aunt Sarah led me out of the house, her grip tight on my arm as if she was afraid I might disappear too. We didn't say much on the drive to her house. I was too numb to speak. But inside, everything was breaking. I felt like I was losing not just my dad, but my whole life. The house I grew up in, the memories of my mom, everything was gone. I spent the next few months at Aunt Sarah's trying to adjust to this new reality. But nothing felt right. I was still grieving, still in pain, but now I had to do it without the one person who should have been there for me. My dad wasn't checking up on me, wasn't calling, and wasn't asking how I was doing. It was like I had ceased to exist in his world. And every time I thought about him moving on with Leah and her kids, I felt like I was being erased from the story of my own life. Aunt Sarah did her best to help me through it. She made sure I stayed on track with school, even when I didn't care. She tried to talk to me, to make me understand that I wasn't alone, but it didn't feel like enough. The pain of losing my father, of being rejected by him, was something I couldn't talk through. It wasn't something anyone could fix. Then the shock came. Aunt Sarah received a wedding invitation from my dad and Leah. They were getting married. I hadn't heard from him in months, and now he was sending me an invitation to his wedding like everything was normal, like nothing had changed. When Aunt Sarah saw the invitation, she was furious. She immediately called my dad, screaming at him for sending it. She told him he was cruel for not even trying to make things right with me before moving on. She told him it was wrong to rub his happiness in my face after everything he had done. But my dad didn't care. He told her that he needed me to be there, that it was important for appearances. He wanted me to be at the wedding so people wouldn't ask about me, to pretend like everything was fine. I couldn't believe it. After everything he had put me through, he was asking me to show up to his wedding, to play the part of a son who had been cast aside, to make his new life look perfect in front of everyone. Aunt Sarah and I talked it over. We both agreed that the only way forward was to attend the wedding, but not to go along with his charade. I was going to make sure the truth came out. So when the wedding day arrived, we went. At the reception, things were as uncomfortable as I imagined. My dad and Leah avoided me. Every time our eyes met, there was this awkward tension. I could tell they didn't know how to act around me anymore. They were pretending like everything was fine, but I knew better. And when the speeches started, I knew it was time. I stood up, took the mic, and with a sarcastic smile, I congratulated the happy couple. I didn't hold back. I made sure everyone knew the truth, that my dad had chosen Leah over me, that he had kicked me out for her and her kids, and how he was trying to erase everything I had been to him. The room went silent, and I could feel every eye on me, on them. My dad's face turned pale. Leah looked horrified, and then Aunt Sarah stood up. She didn't say a word to me, but she didn't need to. She told everyone that I had been living with her for months, that I had been cast aside by my own father, and that we were there not to celebrate but to expose the truth. She looked directly at my dad and said that she was ashamed of him. It was the most satisfying moment I'd had in months. The truth was out, and I didn't care about the consequences anymore. My dad had made his choices, and now everyone knew what kind of man he had become. Since that night, I felt a sense of relief. The weight of keeping this secret, of letting my dad's lies hang over me, is gone. He and Leah tried to reach out to me after the wedding, probably because they couldn't handle the backlash, but I ignored them. I'm done. I'm done pretending. I'm almost 18 now. I've got my aunt's support, and that's all I need. My dad is no longer part of my life, and as much as it hurts, I know it's for the best. I'm going to work hard, build my own life, and make sure I never have to rely on him again. No apology can fix what he's done. He made his